Okay, so let's dive into this. There was this meeting in London, right, about Ukraine.
Yes, and it seems things didn't quite go as maybe some expected.
Exactly. I mean, the initial talk, especially from the UK and France, sounded really strong, even talk of intervention.
Right, a very supportive tone at first.
Eh?
But then, almost immediately after the meeting,
Yeah.
well, the commentary changed.
Yeah, it shifted. Reports started coming out suggesting they were actually pushing Ukraine to concede territory.
Which is quite a pivot, isn't it? From talking intervention to suggesting concessions. It suggests maybe less unity than first appeared.
Definitely. And then there's the U.S. angle. Ambassador Kellogg was there.
Despite some past, let's say, scrutiny about perceived sympathies towards the Ukrainian president's office.
Right. And importantly, it seems there was a separate meeting, Yermak and Kellogg.
Oh, really? What was that about?
Apparently, specifically about a ceasefire. Getting a ceasefire before any real negotiations could even start.
I see. So the U.S. is maybe prioritizing just stopping the fighting first.
Yeah.
Pulling that out from the main talks.
Well, seems like it. It suggests a distinct U.S. goal there.
And this whole U.S.-Europe dynamic.
Yeah.
It feels a bit strained, perhaps.
Yeah, complex is a good word. We heard the Ukrainian president was really seeking White House attention.
And it sounds like he got it, but maybe not in the way he wanted.
Possibly. Reports suggest the relationship with the current U.S. president is actually, well, quite poor.
Stemming from disagreements over past peace talks, I gather.
That's what's being reported. These high-level relationships, they can really impact diplomacy.
Oh, absolutely. A lack of trust there can just, well, grind everything to a halt.
And it got quite public, didn't it? The U.S. president actually criticized the Ukrainian president on social media.
He did. And he confirmed the reason for the U.S. cooling off, so to speak.
Said it was directly because the Ukrainian president wouldn't legally acknowledge Russia's control over Crimea.
Which the U.S. apparently sees as a major obstacle to peace talks moving forward.
Their argument, publicly at least, is that Crimea was lost years ago under a different U.S. administration, and it's not the main focus of the current fighting.
So it's like they're saying, let's deal with the immediate crisis first, maybe park the Crimea issue for now, even if it's a difficult position for Ukraine.
Right. And the U.S. president went further. He questioned why Ukraine didn't fight for Crimea back when it happened.
Contrasting it with the current war.
Yes, and even suggested, quite pointedly, that the Ukrainian president was maybe more focused on his own assets in Russia at the time.
Wow, that's very direct, very personal criticism between leaders.
It really signals a breakdown, doesn't it? Moving beyond policy into something much more acrimonious.
Definitely. And did this disagreement over Crimea affect the London meeting itself?
Apparently so. Reports say the U.S. scaled back its presence.
And then the EU foreign ministers also seemed to take a step back.
Exactly. We even heard about a U.S. special representative, someone not even at the London meeting, suggesting ceding Crimea might be a basis for a deal.
So the message seems pretty clear. The U.S. doesn't want to discuss Crimea as Ukrainian territory right now.
Yeah, it really sounds like, for the moment, that's off the table from their perspective. They seem focused purely on stopping the current war.
And there was a U.S. advisor who tried to rationalize this.
Yes, basically arguing that conceding Crimea isn't such a huge leap.
What was the reasoning?
Well, pointing out it's been out of Kyiv's control for over 11 years, it's mostly ethnic Russians, and crucially, it can't be retaken militarily.
Citing the failed counteroffensive as evidence for that point.
Right, and also arguing that many Crimeans actually identify with Russia now anyway. It's a very pragmatic, maybe even a realpolitik kind of argument.
Yeah, focusing on the reality on the ground, as they say, rather than the ideal outcome, prioritizing the achievable.
This advisor also raised some pointed questions about Crimean activists.
The ones who were very vocal before.
Exactly, noting that many are now in Europe, not fighting, some apparently fundraising.
Any specific examples mentioned?
There was a mention of one activist who married a currently wanted oligarch and is also abroad. It kind of paints a critical picture.
So raising questions about commitment levels across the board, perhaps?
That seems to be the implication. But the core U.S. argument comes back to this. If Kyiv won't even discuss Crimea...
Unlike Donbass, where there have at least been talks, however stalled.
Right. Then what is there for the U.S. to actually negotiate on? They're not demanding legal recognition, reports say, but they want Kyiv to acknowledge the reality.
That really is the sticking point, isn't it? The clash between Ukraine's principle of territorial integrity and the harsh practicalities.
And the U.S. seems to be pushing for pragmatism, even if it feels like accepting Russia's gains.
We're also hearing that statements from the Ukrainian president himself are seen as, well, unhelpful, hindering a resolution.
Yeah, the situation is apparently being framed in D.C. as a stark choice for Kyiv.
Make a deal, however tough.
Or risk losing potentially everything if the war drags on. There was reportedly a warning given.
Saying that this inflexibility just prolongs the conflict, which isn't good for anyone.
Precisely. The stakes are incredibly high, and the U.S. perspective seems to be that a bad deal might be better than total loss down the line.
And what about the Ukrainian president's reported reaction to lacking leverage?
Apparently quite dismissive. When told Ukraine lacked strong negotiating cards, the response was reportedly something like, "We're not playing cards."
Which aligns, worryingly, with what that Russian official said.
Exactly. The Russian official suggesting future terms would only get worse for Ukraine. It paints a grim picture if things continue like this.
It suggests maybe a misreading of the situation, of how the power dynamics might be shifting.
And the personal friction continues. That interview the Ukrainian president gave.
The one that reportedly led to a producer leaving the show.
Yes. That kind of fallout suggests, real irritation in the U.S. president's circle.
These personal elements just keep complicating things, don't they? Eroding trust when it's needed most.
And then, adding to it, the Ukrainian president brought up that 2018 State Department declaration condemning the Crimea occupation.
Right, but that was under a previous, more hawkish U.S. administration.
Exactly. Under a Secretary of State who favored maximum pressure on Russia, a policy Kyiv reportedly liked, but that team isn't in power now.
So relying on past policies that don't have current backing, that doesn't seem very effective.
No. And that warning was repeated. Ukraine could lose everything within 3 years, echoing the Russian official again.
That convergence is striking. U.S. advisors, Russian officials, both painting a picture of urgency and potential worsening conditions.
The current approach from Kyiv, some are calling it pure PR, this no-step-back stance.
But aimed more at a domestic audience, perhaps, than at actual negotiation.
Could be. But the big worry is the U.S. pulling its aid. That's the real concern being voiced.
And the feeling is that EU help just wouldn't be enough to fill that gap.
That's the assessment. It puts Ukraine in a very, very vulnerable position.
And then there were these reports about problems within the Ukrainian military.
Yes, quite disturbing. Allegations of non-combatants paying to avoid the front lines.
While some commanders inflate their records for money.
That's what's being reported. And the sobering assessment is that even mobilizing those people wouldn't change the tide, given Russian advances in weapons.
So the bottom line estimation is
Ukraine might only last about 6 months without U.S. aid, before potentially losing the whole country. Maybe even faster. It's stark.
Wow. That internal situation, combined with the aid uncertainty, it really highlights the critical dependency.
And then a U.S. president spokesperson came out with a very blunt statement.
Criticizing the Ukrainian president's public negotiation tactics.
Directly, saying taxpayers have spent billions, the president is disappointed, losing patience.
And threatening that Washington might just withdraw from the negotiation process.
Yes. It sounds like a serious warning, almost an ultimatum.
That's a major escalation in rhetoric coming directly from the White House. Signals a potential real shift.
And now, according to Western press, even Ukrainian officials are worried.
Worried the U.S. president might openly blame Kyiv for talks failing.
And then halt arms shipments. That's the fear, which would be devastating.
Yeah, a public blame game followed by cutting off weapons. That's pretty much the worst-case scenario for Kyiv, militarily and diplomatically.
Meanwhile, Russia just reiterated its demands. No surprises there.
Troops out of the 4 regions, recognition of territorial realities, neutral status.
Yep, the usual points. Plus some criticism of Europe for relying on the U.S. and being confused.
Standard Russian messaging, really.
Yeah.
Highlighting perceived Western weakness.
But here's an interesting twist. The Russian spokesperson said the Kremlin doesn't demand a change in Ukraine's leadership.
Really? They're okay with the current president?
They suggested they might be. The reasoning given was, well, look at the results. Ukraine has lost territory, racked up debt, millions have left.
So the argument is, the current leader has weakened Ukraine, which actually suits Russia strategically.
That seems to be the cynical logic, yes. Why change a leader if they perceive him as inadvertently helping their long-term goals?
That's quite the perspective. Shifts the focus.
And we're also hearing whispers, potential for a direct meeting between the Russian and U.S. presidents.
Instead of the London talks, maybe?
Possibly. And a U.S. special representative reportedly went to Moscow.
To do what? Explore common ground.
Yes, and apparently also to discuss future business opportunities, regardless of whether peace is achieved.
Business opportunities. Even now. That suggests ongoing back-channel talks about post-conflict scenarios, or even alongside the conflict.
It seems the U.S. might be looking at potential future profits from Russian gas sales.
Envisioning some kind of business partnership. Arctic, maybe elsewhere.
That seems to be part of the calculation, economic interests playing a significant role.
Which complicates the picture further. Geopolitics and big business intertwined.
And this is causing splits within the U.S., right? Differing views.
Seems so. Some pushing for economic engagement with Russia.
While others are worried about betraying Ukraine, still seeing Kiev as a strategic partner.
Exactly. It's the classic interests versus values debate, essentially. Financial gains versus principles.
Though some feel values are becoming less relevant in the current global climate.
So it's a real internal struggle within the U.S. administration about the right path forward, balancing alliances, economics, and ideals.
So, wrapping this up, the situation looks incredibly tough for the Ukrainian president. His diplomatic approach is under fire, especially from the U.S.
And the consequences could be immense for Ukraine's future. It feels like he's potentially navigating towards a very difficult outcome through his current stance.
A precarious moment indeed. The choices seem stark, and the support Ukraine relies on feels increasingly conditional.
Definitely underscores the brutal realities of the conflict and the shifting sands of international diplomacy. The path ahead is very uncertain.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.